Once again, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We know it's getting close to the holiday season, so we very much appreciate you all coming out and joining us, and we appreciate the opportunity to present and have this conversation with you guys tonight. I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then I'll turn it over to Rodney Chapman with Forward Pinellas. I'm Leslie Del Monte with SNME, and we have Patricia Tayeski and Laura Canary. We are the consultants for Forward Pinellas and working with the City of Oldsmar. We understand that you're also going through a comp plan effort, and you're probably done quite a few of these meetings or breakout sessions. So we appreciate you joining us, and hopefully during the presentation you'll realize that this conversation is slightly different. So we definitely want to hear your input tonight. Rodney?
Good evening, everyone. As Leslie said, my name is Rodney Chapman. I'm a planning division manager at Forward Pinellas. So whenever we give these talks, one of the things that we always like to start off with is a little bit about who we are and what we do, because anytime we say Forward Pinellas, people often think we're Pinellas County. Reality is we're not. We actually are an agency that is countywide that focuses on land use and transportation planning. So our purview and wheelhouse crosses every boundary here in Pinellas County and touches every community. We like to say that we help communities make good decisions. We help facilitate conversations, and we provide a forum like we're doing tonight for new ideas, new approaches to help Pinellas County meet the challenges that we all face. There are 25 local governments in Pinellas County. There is almost 1 million people in the county, and we all have about 15 million visitors. So there's a lot of things that we have to account for when we take on initiatives like this. And how do we do that? Well, we report to a 13-member board of elected officials. You'll see their photographs there. They run the gamut of communities, big and small, from unincorporated Pinellas County to the city of St. Pete, city of Clearwater, all the way down to a community as small as Kansas City. For the current cycle, City of Oldsmar will be represented on our board for the next 2 years by Vice Mayor Buckman. We are a planning agency, so the things that we do are not necessarily being able to implement on our own. We have to have partnerships, strong partnerships with our local governments and aligned agencies. So we do these things, such as what we're doing tonight, in our role as a technical assistance body, where we're bringing different tools, different options for the community to consider. And oftentimes, these efforts relate to our key policy documents. And on the transportation side of what we do, that key policy document is the long-range transportation plan. On the land use side of what we do, that policy document is the countywide plan, and that's what we'll talk more about with you tonight. We have been able to add an additional tool for local governments to consider as they plan for the future. We all know that Pinellas County is largely built out, but people are still moving here. We're still having businesses open. We want to be a business-friendly county. So when you have those new employers making jobs available to people, those employees need to have a place to live. And so we have something for you tonight to talk more about as a potential option for you to consider as you move forward in your comprehensive plan update process. I'll now turn it over to Nasheen Rahman of our team, and she'll talk to you more specifically about the purpose of tonight's meeting.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nasheen Rahman, and I am a planner at Forward Pinellas. And part of the capacity we're here in today is to help administer a project that we are funding at Forward Pinellas known as the Urban Design Services Pilot Program. And what all that really means is that we have a new program that is helping our local governments visualize what development and redevelopment looks like for each of our local governments. As Rodney mentioned, there are 25 local governments in Pinellas County, and each is completely unique to itself. So we want to help our local governments maintain their character while also considering what that redevelopment looks like, because as Rodney also mentioned, we are living in a built-out county. So this program is a partnership between ourselves at Forward Pinellas and Pinellas County Housing and Community Development. And Leslie and her team at SNME were selected as the program consultant for the project. And Oldsmar is one of the 3 communities which has received funding from us through the program, meaning that the work that we're doing today is coming from our funds and helping the city determine the options that will be presented to you today in terms of land use for the city. Just a quick overview about the program. It's essentially, like I said, intended to help visualize what change looks like, because all these policies and codes and regulations, they're just words on paper, but ultimately they end up on the ground in your city and make what you know to be your neighborhoods and your surrounding community. So there are 3 components to this program. One is to work with community and neighborhood groups, just as we are today, to host studios and charettes, which are essentially specialized focus groups, to have a discussion about what development or redevelopment looks like. The second is to work with developers to guide urban design and help them function within the existing codes and regulations or new codes and regulations in our local governments. And lastly, the program intends to evaluate or advise on proposed codes or regulations. So we're really here in the capacity of the first bullet point here. And I hope that we'll have a productive discussion and that you all give us your honest feedback. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie.
Thank you so much. So as we get started, and both Rodney and Nasheen touched on it, we're here to listen. Public input is a crucial part of this process. But we want to give you the information, and we want to give you the visual cues for when you're making these decisions and when you're answering the questions that we're asking, you have these ideas in your mind of what these areas and these buildings or potential developments could eventually look like and what Tampa Road Corridor could eventually look like. So one of the first things to understand is the regional context. Oldsmar is in a prime location. It's one of the greatest things it has. It's the corridor itself. And the fact that it's, because of how it's situated, it's really one of the only connections that it's not across the bridges. And that really puts it in a great place for a hub of connectivity. It has a really, really strong employment center. And chatting with some of you earlier, and as we've heard previously from staff and some of the comments that have come from the public during the comp plan efforts, that's also one of the challenges, that a lot of the folks that work in those areas don't actually live in Oldsmar. And you could see later on in the presentation how that could potentially change to reinforce some of those commercial areas. You have the activity center, which is the regional area. There's several of them in the county, and you happen to have one of them. You have really strong residential neighborhoods, and you have large preservation areas, which is also a tremendous asset. Once again, during the comp plan process, there were several surveys that were done and several presentations and breakout groups. And a lot of what was heard was about neighborhood connectivity and different modes of transportation, golf carts, bikes, pedestrian connectivity, and the challenges primarily north and south, connecting both sides of the city. Environmental and sustainability issues came up quite frequently. Traffic and safety, and once again, all modes of transportation, pedestrian, ADA accessibility, golf carts. There's a lot of like micro mobility happening in a lot of the smaller cities, and we're seeing some of that happen here, and how the city could begin to make room so that that happens safely. The lack of downtown development, and once again, you have that sort of asset of as a regional and geographic hub, but it's not really coming through in your downtown. That lack of vibrancy is something that was brought up. And then sort of to back that is the desirability for stronger commercial uses, retails, restaurants, and gathering areas. And of course, a big fear is always growth. And how do you grow sustainably, and how do you grow in the right areas of the city? So once again, we protect those really strong established residential neighborhoods. So looking at the population that exists today, it's just shy of 15,000. And what you see here is you have about 7% of families with kids under 5. And you have about 20% under 18. What does that tell us? That is actually a really important statistic, because younger families are looking for housing types and commercial areas and districts that are slightly different than other older generations. And it's really important to pose the city for those changes in the future to accommodate those needs. But what we're looking at is from those 15,000, in about 20 years, we're looking at a growth of about 10,000. So how do we do that? How do we accommodate that in, as Nosheen said, in a basically built out county? So how do we do that effectively so that your neighborhoods and the areas that you value are protected, but we do it sustainably so that the city could grow organically? And one of the ways to do that is through smart growth principles. And I'll just run through these quickly, but you'll begin to see how some of these really translate into some of the tools that are being given to us in order to make that happen. There's 10 smart growth principles, which allow us to do just that. It allows us to put additional population into like outgrown cities that could be accommodated in smart ways. And the primary one is a mix of land uses. Taking advantage of compact design. What does that mean? That means grouping uses together and grouping buildings together. It's basically the opposite of sprawl. Creating a range of housing opportunities and choices. This one's particularly important. I was having a great conversation with one of you earlier regarding the necessity for different housing types for young professionals, and particularly those that you want staying in Oldsmar. If you're older and you have kids or grandkids that you want staying in your area, they have to be able to afford the housing in the area. Creating walkable neighborhoods. Once again, we want those vibrant neighborhoods. Fostering distinctive, attractive communities with a strong sense of place. Once again, it's that attractive asset type of community that you want to be a part of. Preserve open space, farmland, natural beauty, and critical environmental areas. You're already doing that with the high percentage of preservation areas that you have. Direct development towards existing communities. Once again, avoiding the sprawl and putting those areas of additional development in areas that already exist and could afford that. But doing so strategically in very specific places. Provide a variety of transportation choices. We go back to that mobility question and allowing for different modes. Make development decisions predictable, fair, and cost-effective. I mean, I think that goes without saying. We all want that, right? From a perspective of a resident, a business owner, a developer, it's the smart thing to do for a city. And then finally, encourage community and stakeholder collaboration in the development decisions. And that's what we're doing here tonight. We're giving you all this information so that then we could listen to your thoughts and your vision for the city. And typically when we talk back to, and you could kind of begin to piece all these concepts together as I go through the presentation, when you talk about concentrating and compact design, you're typically talking about a half a mile radius from those major corridors. So this is that half a mile here from the Tampa Road corridor. So essentially, the majority of the conversation tonight is going to be within that half a mile. And I noticed some of you saying on the map, well, I'm off the map slightly. And that is why, because we really want the conversation today to focus on that half mile. And you'll see how that half mile becomes a little bit smaller as we go through the presentation. But part of that is also, once again, with the mindset of protecting those really strong residential neighborhoods. And here we see that a little bit more zoomed in. And if we start to look at existing uses, you could see the breakdown of the existing uses. And you have about 25% of the uses that are residential uses and 27% that is commercial. And typically, in most cities, for a vibrant neighborhood, you actually want the opposite. You kind of are looking for like a 3-2 ratio of residential that supports that commercial. So you want that mass, you want the critical mass, you want the residents to be present to invigorate commercial neighborhoods. So it really should probably be the opposite. But I also want to note, which is kind of unusual, that you do have that 48% of preservation, which is pretty incredible. So when we start looking at the development pattern, I think you'll notice, do this exercise called a field study, and you'll start to see the buildings, and you really start to focus on the buildings along the corridor, and you start to see the gaps. And as you're driving it, as a resident, I myself, as I experience my city or other cities that I visit, I don't always take the time to stop and see really what's missing. So we're gonna walk through a bit of that. And here they are a little bit more highlighted. And you could really start to see what that creates. You have uses that are scattered. You have a lack of connectivity between uses. You create ample spaces for parking, but not enough spaces for people and pedestrians and that desired gathering space. So what does that look like, and why do these cities feel like that? You have these enormous setbacks. You have non-contiguous setbacks that really don't incentivize, don't prompt you to continue walking. You don't have walkable, interconnected walkways that will allow you to treat the area like a district and really meander through the way you would in a vibrant commercial area or mixed-use area. You don't have a whole lot of shade trees, and that's really, if the walk is there but it's not comfortable, you're probably not going to do it. Obviously narrow sidewalks. And if you notice things like the buildings with the lack of transparency, the large setbacks, and even the signage is all geared towards vehicles and not the pedestrian. So when we look, and this is a website that you could all access, and if you're curious, you could kind of plug different places in and see how they compare. It's called walkscore.com. So in there, it's rating Oldsmar as 53% walkable, which is somewhat walkable. Again, not great. And 62% bikeable, so that bikeability is slightly higher. But what this doesn't take into consideration, and you could see the concentration of uses there and you could see the proximity, which is really what this scores, what it doesn't take into consideration is that earlier slide, is the comfort level and quality of that walkability or quality of life in those areas. Oh, and then just once again, touching on these concepts because I want you to keep them in mind as we start going through some of these conversations. One of the things that all of these concepts brings together is land use. What is land use? As we said earlier, many of you have participated in the conversations and the breakout groups or surveys regarding the comp plan effort. The comp plan looks specifically at land use. Land use is mandated by the state and through the county, through the municipalities. So you have to be consistent, the municipality has to be consistent with the county land use. What does it do? It's the first layer of regulation. It establishes uses and intensities for a city. On top of that, what you have is the zoning layer or zoning map and zoning regulations. That is on a municipal level. That is done through city ordinance. And that one gets a little bit more specific and establishes development thresholds, setbacks, heights, and things of that nature. And then on top of that, you have yet another finer layer, which is design guidelines or standards. And those really get to what does that building look like? What does that public realm feel like? And what characteristics do we want to see in these areas? So that's really essentially the development framework or regulation framework that we have to work with as consultants or municipalities. And today we're here to talk about specifically that toolbox of the future land use. So that first layer of regulation. The county has created two categories, which is essentially what this conversation is really about and what we want feedback on. It has created two categories that are specifically geared towards mixed use and transit-oriented or transit-ready districts. What they do is essentially incentivize or create the background so that zoning regulations could then allow for a mix of uses. In your commercial corridors today, the uses are segregated. You cannot have residential and commercial in most areas of the city together. This allows for that. These two categories are different because the Multimodal Corridor, or MMC, is a little bit higher in intensity. It is intended to connect two activity centers to each other. As we talked earlier, and you saw on the map, from the regional perspective, you only have one activity center, and the length of your corridor is quite small. So that category is probably not the most appropriate for Oldsmar. So what we're really focusing on is the Planned Redevelopment District category, or PRD. And what PRD says is that it is purposed for mix of residential and non-residential uses within neighborhoods or district areas that are interrelated and complementary, with densities and intensities, and urban design that promote walking, biking, and transit use. Once again, if you think back to those principles of smart growth, this is geared exactly towards that. This category is intended for areas that are more dense, intense than the typical surrounding community, but less dense and intense than an activity center. So if you picture your town center, activity center, what we're talking about would be less intense than that. And they support the planning that facilitates infill and redevelopment. We'll see what that looks like in a variety of densities and building styles. So if we go back to that map, This is now your adopted future land use categories. This is what the city is working towards as far as uses. And you can see there in the blue, that's your town center. And the magenta area there is the employment hub. And as we zoom in, you begin to see those categories a little bit closer. And what I want to emphasize is, and once again, we're looking at the half mile, but as I said earlier, you're going to begin to see how that half mile gets smaller when we focus it to specific areas. And what I want to emphasize is that we're really focusing on that retail, services, and employment categories. And the purpose of doing that is, once again, protecting those residential neighborhoods and those areas that are well established. So we were looking at the half mile, but when we really look at where these categories are appropriate, the half mile gets smaller and goes into really specific focus areas, which are the ones we want to talk about tonight, and the ones we want you to have in mind when you're answering the questions. And the idea here, obviously, is to continue to emphasize that connectivity along the corridor, connectivity north and south to both areas of the city, either from a biking perspective, a walking perspective, even a vehicular perspective, if it's taking you longer than usual, or that walk is not very safe. We want to make the case, obviously, for that integration of uses. You need that residential component for a vibrant commercial district. You need that 24/7 feel so that those residents really support the commercial uses that exist, and you don't have areas of employment, for example, or areas of commercial that basically don't exist after 6 o'clock in the evening. And you want that integration of mix of uses to support that. So part of the question tonight, and you'll see some of that in the boards that you could spend some time on after the presentation, is where does that begin to happen? Are there areas that we should prioritize along the corridor? Or is it the corridor itself? Or are there specific areas where this should start and act as a catalyst for the rest of the corridor? So very much like we looked at that existing character, these are places we look at and we usually see as desirable. But what makes them desirable? It's really the public realm. It's that character that makes us want to walk or travel or be part of districts like this. It's the wide sidewalks, the buildings adjacent to the sidewalk, so that you have, once again, that trigger to continue to walk. That continuous use allows you to keep your interest going. Active uses also. If you're all of a sudden, if you're walking down a district and you see 200 feet of a blank wall, you're probably not going to continue walking. You're going to turn right back around. And there, once again, the active frontages, buffers, safety is a really big component. And obviously, it's not just an aesthetic issue, which obviously it does make for a much more pleasant walking experience from a visual perspective, but it is also a safety issue. And buffers do a great deal towards that. Same thing with shade trees. It makes it more pleasant. They protect the pedestrian. They also, obviously, from an environmental perspective, they make places cooler. So you always want to integrate shade trees. You want that walk to be comfortable. Transparent and permeable frontages. You want that activity, once again, to entice you to keep going. You want that interest to keep you going from block to block. And you want to be enticed by the uses that you see. You want to say, I'm coming to this store, but hey, I just saw a restaurant across the street that I'm going to come back to tomorrow. And outdoor seating and outdoor dining obviously support those concepts. So what could that potentially look like? This is a lot of what we see on the corridor today. think back to that slide that shows those vast areas of parking, the huge setbacks, really no continuity of sidewalks, no continuity of street trees to make that walk comfortable. So when we begin to look at these categories, we like to say zoning and land use are slow medicine. It doesn't mean that the corridor is going to look like what we're about to show you tomorrow. It means it will happen gradually, little by little, and it builds on each other. So one of the things that could happen is infill development. It could be that some of those areas, those plazas, those existing commercial shopping centers, for example, stay the same, but they get what we call infill development or art parcel development that is done in an appropriate manner that begins to engage the Tampa Road corridor and begins to create that walkability and really fills that gap so that you have that continuity that I keep emphasizing. And here you see what some of those could begin to look like. And we go back to those previous images with the shade trees, the wider sidewalks, and all of those components that really make these kind of districts desirable. Here we have another look. And here we have some outdoor seating, again, emphasizing those active uses. And all of this goes to support that integration of uses. And then one more iteration would be complete redevelopment of one of these areas. And what could that look like? Again, bringing all those concentration of uses towards the corridor. What does that do? It protects the residential neighborhoods and it keeps that growth manageable and sustainable. And that integration of uses is really important because it's what's going to make these places vibrant. You could see those wide sidewalks, shopping promenades, active uses, transparencies on the facade, and of course, outdoor seating and bike parking and all of those elements that are so crucial to a really good public realm that are noticeably missing from a lot of our corridors, not just in Oldsmar, but in South Florida in general. Once again, that transparency and things like shading become so important for that comfort level. So tonight, we're here to listen. So now that you have all this information, now that you understand what this category focuses on, you understand the focus area, what is it that we want to know from you? We want to understand what is the desired character for the Tampa Road corridor. How do you envision the Tampa Road corridor? What sustainability methods could be incorporated? As we know, that was one of the topics that came up quite frequently in the previous surveys. So what can we do to incorporate that? What would make mobility along the corridor safer? And what would make the corridor more connected and the neighborhoods more connected? Is compact mixed-use development appropriate along the corridor? And if so, where? What kind of uses would you like to see along the corridor? Because that's really important. Some of these uses support each other, so we have to understand those dynamics. So understanding what you'd like to see really gives us an idea on how to move forward. And finally, where is the PRD land use category appropriate for the corridor? So we have workshop activities that we'd like you to participate in. I know some of you started to do that earlier, and I saw some really great answers and some of you engaging and kind of picking up on things others were doing and saying, which is exactly what we want. We want this to be a conversation. We want to hear from you because like that 10th principle of smart growth is engaging the public and understanding really what the public wants. And here are some of those other activities. We want you to, the instructions are on the boards. We want you to take the stickers and really focus. Think about what you've just heard. Tell us where you want the focus areas to be. Tell us what your priorities are. Tell us where you live. Tell us where you work. Tell us how long it takes you to get somewhere. Tell us what's a challenge. Tell us what's an asset. There are a lot of community assets in Oldsmar that we would like to build on. Where are those and how could we capitalize on those? So what happens after today? Today is the workshop. After the workshop, as the consultants, we're going to put all the information together that we've gathered. We're going to take all your answers, all the data that we gather here tonight, synthesize everything we hear, and put together a report for the city. After that, the city and the consultants team together, we're going to determine how to move forward. What does that mean? Is PRD appropriate for the Tampa Road corridor? And then if so, then it would take a land use amendment. It could potentially be incorporated into the comp plan effort, or it could be done separately. We'll have to make that determination. The city will have to determine how to move forward, but it needs to do that with your input. And then eventually it will adopt the corresponding zoning regulations to go along with that. You'll remember that image that layered all of those regulations one on top of the other. And finally, are there any questions? I know it was a lot of information. Hopefully, I didn't lose you. If I need to go back to any slide, let me know. If you have a question, raise your hand. And obviously, we're happy to talk more specifically at the boards if you'd like. But if you have any specific questions, feel free.
All right. So can you give us an example maybe of some of the work or layout that you were talking about that would be on Tampa Road corridor? Because, just trying to visualize it, you don't see a lot of that on US Highway 19, okay? Even in, we'll use St. Pete as an example, that their walkability and that kind of biking traffic and everything else isn't on 275. That's down, 4th, maybe even, Shore Drive even more, even 4th is a little too busy for that. So for a busy street like Tampa Road, can you give us another example of where we may know that or see that?
As far as like local example that you might know, Laura?
Anywhere in Pinellas County.
I think really what you're emphasizing is that center part of the road is essentially not changing. We're focusing on the private property, right? But that's why those public realm regulations are so important because, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, is it appropriate then to, and I know I'm kind of shifting it a little bit, but should the walkability aspect, because, you mentioned golf carts, you mentioned bikes and walkability and everything else, should that comfort zone might not be, and I know the corridor is that half mile, on either side, but not geared towards the face of Tampa Road itself, but maybe the backside of whatever those buildings are? Should it be more in away from the road as opposed to, in those seating areas and everything you're talking about?
Hi, my name is Pat Tayeski. We work together. Sometimes we think that it's a state road, it's FDOT, it's never going to change. But even FDOTs are changing their tune. They're talking about context sensitivity. So it's not about an arterial that goes through the rural, suburban, and urban, and it looks the same because the idea is just to move cars. That's not what they're doing anymore. Now we know that, yes, it's an arterial, it's going to carry a lot of traffic, but it can be designed in a way that is going to be safe for pedestrians and bicycles. So the idea is that we don't give up. Don't give up. Don't think that it's always going to be like this in Oldsmar. We have examples from different communities in other states too, where they tame these corridors to the point where, like today, you would think, do I want to do outdoor sitting on that road? I mean, it's going to be pollution and it's going to be very fast. But it has happened in other places where all of a sudden the buffer area is wider. you have a wide sidewalk, and then you have your outdoor seating area. So it is hard to visualize, and those pictures may seem like it's very far from the reality that we see today, but they're possible. And we just Leslie mentioned it's slow medicine. It's not going to happen next year. It's not going to happen in 5 years. But should we give up for future generations, or do we want to build something better for the future generations?
And sorry, just to build on that, and I think that's why it's so important to kind of get ahead of it, not necessarily wait for FDOT, not necessarily wait for the road to change, but use the tools that we have at our disposal today to begin to prescribe what that corridor could look like in the areas that we already control today, and then those other things will follow. Go ahead. Sorry, we have somebody else.
My question is probably similar to his, the fact that why would I want to sit with my back to traffic going by 45, 60 miles an hour on Tampa Road? What I would want a major buffer between that and where I'm at, the stores, the restaurants, and those kinds of things. And I know it's not going to happen anytime soon, but wouldn't the focus, to me, sound more like it should be off of Tampa Road and not on the Tampa corridor?
And I want to explain this picture a little bit more. So this one here is Tampa Road, right? So the idea is that right now you have parking and a building way in the back. So if somebody comes here by bus or bicycle or walked from nearby place, they would have to walk through that parking lot all the way to the back. How safe is that, and how attractive is that? So as you can see from this design, we're creating boulevards that are pedestrian friendly to get to the big box that is in the back. So yes, we're not putting everything on Tampa Road. There would be opportunities to bring the commercial into those streets. And they are like the narrower, more landscaping, on-street parking, where you can have a safer environment for people. So yeah, it's not all on this side. The idea is to turn all these big parking lots into more livable spaces, that it's not just so focused on the automobile, but all modes of transportation.
Speaking of all this work that you're trying to do, it seems like you're focusing on the Tampa corridor. I live off Lexington and Shore, and I would love to see more focus on that corridor where the pub is along State Street. Or how much impact are they going to put, or how much effort are they going to put into developing that now so that we have a town center? That's why I would think the focus should go there first for Oldsmar before the corridor.
So the area that you're mentioning is part of the town center, which already has its adopted regulations. So that is what Leslie was mentioning is the established activity center, and the activity center is already an adopted land use category. So there are regulations in place for that, and the idea is the whole concept of slow medicine. Those regulations are creating parameters within which development can function in the way that you're mentioning, creating those pedestrian-friendly environments around retail and restaurant uses that already exist. So the reason we're talking so much about the Tampa Road corridor is because the map that you saw there with the different categories, the red, the purple, those are all segmented categories versus the town center, which already was, as you saw, completely in blue. It already has adopted regulations. We just haven't seen those changes happen yet because typically, in planning, we think 10, 15, 20 years down the line. And it takes time to see that change, as we've all reiterated. So that's why we're focusing on the Tampa Road corridor, not to neglect our town center, but to rather bring in regulations that tie in the efforts that are already being done for the town center as well.
Having been born in Pinellas County, I think I know the answer to this question already. However, it's gorgeous going over the Gandy Bridge, Courtney Campbell, Howard Franklin. This is the only major corridor to Tampa. So what's the state of cooperation with Hillsborough County at mass transit? How does all this come together into something cohesive? Because we are, in my opinion, as a resident here, this is the ideal location to live in Tampa Bay, right? But the transit part of it, and a cooperative spirit, since we're border that, is there a Go Hillsborough?
Great question. I'll ask you to think back a few years before the pandemic. And so You may recall there was an All for Transportation initiative on the ballot in Hillsborough County before the pandemic, and it passed by almost 60%. And we in Pinellas County followed that very closely. And based on the actions of the citizens in Hillsborough County, we were aligning our steps and our elected officials to put a ballot question in front of the voters that November. Unfortunately, the pandemic happened and all the momentum disappeared. And then the challenge in Hillsborough to their referendum was successful, which required it to go back in front of the voters this past November, and it failed. And so one of the things that I like to tell citizens is to have the sort of mass transit that you would like to see and that you see in other places. We all have traveled, around the country, around the world, and you've taken mass transit, and it's great. But it requires a local funding source to supplement those state and federal funds. And right now, we don't have that in Pinellas County. We don't have it in Hillsborough County. But we are talking to our counterparts, and we're trying to find ways to improve mass transit across counties, even though we don't have the local funding source yet. So, it's unfortunate that the referendum was legally challenged and overturned in Hillsborough County because it did set the region back a few years. But I wouldn't give up hope, because our position is, at least for us at Forward Pinellas, we want to enable our communities to build in those densities and intensities. So when the time comes where we do have that local funding source, then our community is ready, made for transit, as Leslie said, sort of transit ready. And Tampa Road Corridor is a prime corridor for that connectivity.
Oh, man, this is like deja vu. First of all, the shopping center where Lowe's is, that's in Hillsborough County.
Yes.
So make sure you draw that distinction with the people there. And I know a lot of this, only because my background is, and I'll hold myself and take the blame for a lot of stuff that you folks see out there. I was the zoning administrator for Hillsborough County for 27 years. So a lot of the stuff you see up and down Hillsborough Avenue and Tampa Road, I take responsibility for. I did not necessarily create it, and I didn't build it, but I certainly was involved in the allowability of the zoning regulations and the things that were put in place that allowed that development to happen. I'm not proud of all of it. A lot of things have happened since I left when I retired and went to other things. You may be familiar with Double Branch Road that comes off of Hillsborough Avenue to the south side of it. There's a lot of environmental area in there, and some of that area is environmental in perpetuity and won't be developed, and that's a good thing for all of us that live here in this area. But there are some apartment complexes that are permitted there, and then there's some commercial development that got created up at the front. I can tell you that commercial development was not what was permitted and approved by the Board of County Commissioners when they passed on that zoning. It was supposed to be and was intended to be, and a guy named Ed Taranchek, who you may be familiar with, can vouch for me on that one. It was supposed to have been like Northwood Plaza over on McMullen Booth and Enterprise in Clearwater. That was the example that was used of the type of commercial development that we wanted to go there. A walkable environment for the people that were living in the apartment complexes right next door. I mean, we sold the neighborhood on that concept. So what happened? That concept went away. Other people came in. Developers with money came in. They had a list of allowable uses. And you know what they did? They permitted every one of them individually, all over that site, all over that acreage. So now you've just got a bunch of mishmash of a bunch of commercial development, and its orientation is totally to the highway. That is not what we want to see happen in Oldsmar. There are some uses that are entirely appropriate on the highway. I mean, it's difficult to incorporate a gasoline service station into a little neighborhood complex. Its orientation is the road as it should be. But there are a lot of things that can be done even with the existing development that we have, and things that I believe we can do to change the codes like require cross access between uses that are all in one development parcel. So if you park in one part of the shopping center area, you can and you need to drive to another part of it, you can without having to get back out on the main road again. I mean, those little things like that make all the difference in the world. And it makes you feel like as you're driving your car that you're in a safer environment, that you're more of an enclosed space, and uses tend to build off of each other when they know that people can come and go between uses. It's like you go to one and, as you said, see the restaurant and you say, I'll come back here tomorrow or something. We've got little shopping centers up and down Tampa Road right now in Oldsmar that are just screaming, redesign me into something else. They have too many access points on the Tampa Road, which is the first thing that makes them a Tampa Road development. If you can restrict the number of access points onto Tampa Road, or do like the internal street design like you were looking up there, or maybe it's the entryway to a subdivision and it feeds off of and into those commercial areas, you know. I'm not sure in my head why it's absolutely necessary that a restaurant like, say, Tijuana Flats has to have an access point off Tampa Road when they could. There's a regular street there that everybody can turn into, and then there can be cross access and feed into it. I won't take up a whole lot of more time, but my tendency is to, rather than, just like the others have said, rather than putting so much emphasis on that corridor as to what's allowed and all that, we need to be working with what's allowed behind it and how it's designed so that people can actually use it for the neighborhood uses that benefit the neighborhood. A giant car wash doesn't do anything to help the neighborhood, I can tell you. And I drive by the damn thing every day. It's not benefiting me at all. And it does create problems for people who live there. It's benefiting a lot of people in Palm Harbor, I guess, and maybe East Lake Woodlands that like to use it, not us. That's what we need to be working on, is the design of our existing commercial areas and how we can tweak them to make it better.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the background. I think that's extremely important, and you've made some really great points. And I want to clarify that when we talk about the corridor, it really has that depth. It has that either half mile or just slightly shorter depth. And the fact that you're all saying, and we heard from several of you, don't focus so much on the corridor, goes to how we all think about the corridor. We think about the corridor as one line. We still think about it linearly. And what I want to challenge all of you as you look at these boards and you face these questions is to think about it. When we say corridor, it's really a district. It's a district with depth, where exactly what Pat described, where these boulevards begin to link that forward-facing, more commercial state road and those softer, more walkable streets that lend themselves to additional activity, either perpendicular or towards the rear of that. So again, I want to emphasize that when we say corridor, that corridor is not one line. That corridor has depth. And we have to start thinking about the corridor as a district and not just this linear road.
What are you going to do about the increase in traffic on that?
So one of the things, and Pat could certainly elaborate, but one of the things that smart growth builds on is that when you have these mix of uses, it's a capture district. So you actually reduce traffic by having all of these mixed uses coexist.
I was just going to mention that when all those, the 10,000 people that are going to be here in the future, if we put them in single family homes in the periphery, they're going to be driving their cars to go to the restaurants, to the grocery stores, to City Hall. If we start accommodating some of those new residents in apartments or condos in a district like this, they don't have to use a car. They can walk, they can bike, they'll have everything within reach.
So if we're not going to have big parking lots, and I understand the concept about not having a big parking lot, where are these people that are coming in to shop these areas going to park? I mean, if you're putting the businesses on the road and then putting the parking lots in the back, that's not much of a difference.
No, and that is one possibility. But as you begin to look at the redevelopment, you're also talking about structured parking integrated into these buildings.
And then just to touch on what somebody else said about Tampa, if they're not participating and continuing anything, then it's not going to really help. I mean, if anybody travels Forest Lakes going into Tampa area, when you get to Racetrack Road, everything, we opened everything up 2 lanes in each direction. You get to Tampa Road or Racetrack Road, it's 1 lane. It all bottles back up. It doesn't really help. If we don't have continuity.
The continuity just not within the city, but outside.
My daughter has a question about the sidewalks.
Can you put misters on the sidewalks, please?
Can we put what?
Misters, she was actually born in Arizona, and in that area they have misters everywhere because it's 100-degree heat, and it gets humid here too, so that might be a good thing to have.
Misters would certainly make that walk more comfortable.
You said in your presentation that we're going to add 10,000 people in Oldsmar. You then said it's totally built out. And I don't know where we're going to put 10,000 people. Unless we took over the Oldsmar flea market and a couple of other things. But probably 50% of what you're talking about in your corridor is less than 10 years old. All of the hotels and the redo of the existing Oldsmar Town Center. And it's good to talk about it, but it doesn't sound like a 20-year plan. It sounds like a 50-year plan, because where in God's name is all of this going to occur? I mean, you've got Tate's. You're going to tell Walmart that they have to build a parking garage so that we can put up some apartment houses. I mean, I just don't see, who's going to pay for all of this structured parking?
Developers. When you make a place that is desirable, or when a developer feels like they could be the first one in the door and create the catalyst for something great, they jump to do that sort of thing. And you touched on a few things that I want to clarify. We understand the sensitivities with that, which is actually why we picked a sort of neutral site and generic site, that it really could be anywhere along the corridor, but we understood the sensitivities around some of these sites. We don't want anyone to think, well, does that mean you're knocking down Walmart? Does that mean you're knocking down the flea market? So we wanted to be sensible about that and protect that. But the market really drives that. It's those property owners that begin to see the potential and kind of jump, and it's kind of like dominoes. It all builds on each other, which is also why it's slow medicine, because sometimes you don't have everyone, jump right away. But when they start to see incremental changes, it begins to happen. I always, many years ago, I used to work at a firm that was actually responsible for a lot of the changes that happened down south in Miami Beach. And they always used to tell the story that the revitalization of Miami Beach actually started with buckets of paint. So Miami Beach was made over for a movie set. and all the buildings were repainted. And all of a sudden somebody said, well, these buildings that we've been sort of overlooking are kind of nice and probably something that should be protected. And that's how the historic district came, and that's how all that focus for Miami Beach started to happen. And it really was buckets of paint. So it's these small incremental changes. I worked with an applicant in another South Florida community that it was actually a gas station, and they were coming in to add a pump and repaint the building. And after talking about how the development happening and how the development was actually in a corridor very, very similar to Tampa Road, and with zoning and land use very, very similar to the PRD category. It was actually called TOC, Transit Oriented Corridor. They decided to completely redo their site. They kept their use, which was protected, but they completely redeveloped their site. They made a much larger convenience store, which was at that point not a convenience store. They called it a market. They put it on the corner, and they shifted their entire prototype to put the gas pumps towards the rear to really engage that corridor. So I think it's things like that that seem minimal, but when you really take them into consideration and you take it one at a time, those incremental changes go a really long way towards changing the character of a place.
Okay, so then what has to be done to change the developer's attitude toward Oldsmar? I guess when you consider that the City Hall site has been going through development proposals and revisions for, I don't know, 25 years or something. There's no one, I don't think there's anyone jumping at the opportunity to develop something in Oldsmar because it's so tightly controlled and by residents and the city. What's going to change that makes Oldsmar all of a sudden a hotbed of residential activity?
Yeah, like Leslie mentioned, this is the very first step. This is making sure that whenever somebody's ready to do that, we have the regulations in place to welcome them. It's like we're rolling out the red carpet for somebody to come and do that. Now, other communities have decided to put the little, thought out there, and sometimes they partner. The cities may partner with somebody from the private sector and build a small project that can start it all over. It started to happen, but at this point, this is like the very basic first step that the city is considering. Just change the regulations so that we're ready for whenever somebody's coming to do this.
This is just a little on the side topic. Has there been any discussion about a way for pedestrians and bicyclists to safely cross Tampa Road? Because right now I will not take my family. I mean, it's for teenagers, kids. It's not safe.
That's certainly part of this conversation, and we heard that loud and clear, from the previous surveys, and it becomes clear when you look at the area and some of the even physical barriers and constraints that you have to emphasize that connectivity. And as I said a little bit earlier, we kind of control what we can at that moment, and right now the tool in front of us that we have until we could get FDOT and all those other components is the land use and begin to control what happens, in that private area, but still in the public realm to make those areas safer.
Leslie, can I add something?
Yeah, absolutely.
I need to be on the mic or
We can hear you.
Good question. We had a similar situation on US 19 in Clearwater, just south of State Road 60. I don't know how many of you guys drive that corridor, but there are residential concentrations on either side of US 19, and people were actually dodging traffic to get from one side of the road to the other. They didn't want to go down to Bel Air, or they didn't want to go up to State Road 60. So we were able to program a pedestrian, overpass in that location. So if you drive down that stretch of US 19 now, you will see a new overpass from the west side of US 19, south of 60, to the east side, and the city of Clearwater has now branded it with their color scheme and logo, and it's a nice, attractive feature. So through these community conversations that you're having, that sort of improvement could be a possibility for Oldsmar if you're able to have the regulations in place to have those concentrations of activity on either side of the roadway. That's sort of the key that FDOT looks for when making those kind of decisions.
One thing that I haven't heard anybody talk about so far, maybe in earlier workshop, and that's the issue of sustainability. You know, half of Oldsmar is labeled for residential evacuation for any kind of major storm that comes through here. I mean, seriously, if you're south of Tampa Road, at some point they're going to tell you to get out of Dodge and you're going to have to evacuate. How does that play into us in the city looking to developers to build additional residential areas, even if it's townhomes or multifamily? There doesn't seem to be, there's no particular qualification on that. And, you know, this past year's really shown us a lot. So what are we doing? How are we sustainability in our development plans?
No, that's an excellent question. And, you know, there's so many factors to consider. And with the one that you're talking about, that Oldsmar exists in what we call the coastal high hazard area, really the flood zone, that's something that at Forward Pinellas we address through certain criteria that all land use changes that go through us that exist within the coastal high hazard area have to meet certain criteria. We address things like access to evacuation routes, access to shelter, but also we acknowledge that we already have a shortage in shelter space, so we're having conversations with the Emergency Management Department in Pinellas County to determine how to mitigate shelter impacts. And that also exists, you know, trickles down at the local level. All of our local governments are required to adopt the same standards that we have, and oftentimes they are more restrictive in their standards in terms of what they allow. And a really good example is in the city of Oldsmar, in your town center. All of the development that comes through the town center has to form a development agreement with the city. So developers have to form basically a contract with the city saying how they are going to mitigate impacts in the coastal high hazard area. And that's not a requirement that we have. That's an option that is available to all of our local governments, and Oldsmar is exercising that. It is a hard balance because a lot of the city is in that flood zone, but also people are still moving here, and we have to balance those two. We're always still trying to figure out the answer, but rest assured it is something that is factored into our regulations.
Okay, I think we'll take maybe one last question and move on to the activities.
The focus of this is, for the most part, Tampa Road, even though we're talking about, I think the majority of us are talking about getting off of Tampa Road as part of the corridor and what you're looking to fund maybe in the future. And you're trying to entice 10,000 more people to the city of Oldsmar and what needs to be created for them to be sustainable here. But the reality is, you know, all these people in this room are residents of Oldsmar, I believe. And I think one of the things that's neglected here is, what are the residents of Oldsmar going to get out of this? Not something that's 20 years down the road. I mean, look at Tampa Road from Curlew all the way up to East Lake. There isn't a street light one. It's a major parks and recreation area, and it's as dark as they come. Look at what they did to Forest Lakes Boulevard. They opened it up, they widened it to Tampa, so our neighborhoods get a lot more traffic, and then it bottlenecks down to a 2-lane road from Tampa Road to 580. It just doesn't make any sense. They should have fixed that before they ever thought about going north of Tampa Road. But those are things that you could give residents that live here something that says, we're working on issues that impact you now, and at the same time looking at the future of what is possibly Oldsmar 20 years from now. But I think you got to give a little before you just start, you know, taking everything else. So, and it's not really well, it is a question. What are you going to do when he talked about traffic between Tampa Road and 580 on Forest Lakes, and what are you going to do about the street lights that aren't there and haven't been? I've lived here 22 years, and there hasn't been a street light one on Tampa Road by the, what is it called now, Oldsmar Sports Complex? That's disgraceful. I mean, there's kids that you ride bicycles in the dark to go to that complex. It doesn't make any sense.
Thank you, and I appreciate the comments. One point that I want to make sure that we all capture is we're not trying to entice 10,000 residents. The 10,000 residents are projected. They're coming whether we like it or not. So it's what do we do with them? How do we plan ahead so that we accommodate them in a way that is smart and that is appropriate for the residents that are already here? But I think you bring up some excellent points. And it's all those other components like capital improvements and transit improvements and things like that that also play a role in this. This tool that we're talking about with land use is just one component of all of that. Okay, so if there's no more questions, we would love to talk to all of you individually. We'll be at the boards, the whole team. Thank you, everyone, so much for coming in. I know towards December it gets difficult with the holidays, so I have to say I really, really appreciate you coming in. I appreciate all your comments, and I appreciate your desire and your commitment to improving the city. Thank you all so much.
Well, so now I have a better understanding. So it appears that they closed it because you want to go. You got to drive all the way down.
But it kind of it builds on the assets that already exist, which I think is crucial.